Good afternoon. I'm Dean Verna Williams, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for this year's Harold C. Schott Lecture. This annual event, which is a highlight of the fall semester, is possible because of a generous gift from the Schott Foundation, which supports faculty excellence here at the College of Law. In addition, the fund allows us to recognize one and only one faculty member for outstanding research and scholarly achievement each year. This year's recipient of the Harold C. Schott Scholarship Award is Mark Godsey. The Daniel P. and Judith L. Carmichael Professor of Law and Director of the Lois and Richard Rosenthal Institute of Justice and its Ohio Innocence Project. Professor Godsey is a shining example of the college's culture of bridging practice and theory. With a background as a prosecutor and a scholar, Professor Godsey has shaped our Innocence Project into one of the most active and most successful in the world, with 27 exonerations to its credit so far. As a scholar, Professor Godsey has examined critical issues of justice and criminal defense through the lens of his experience as what he terms a prosecutor's prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. His articles have appeared in such publications as the Duke Law Journal, the California Law Review, and the Georgetown Law Journal. Professor Godsey also is a public intellectual. You may have seen him commenting on issues relating to wrongful convictions in both the local and national media, in such places as Dateline, Forensic Files, the BBC, NPR, the New York Times, Newsweek, the Wall Street Journal, and, in a true demonstration of the reach of his voice, People magazine. Professor Godsey's latest work and the focus of today's talk is Blind Injustice. This combination, memoir, scholarly volume, explores how human frailty, like memory malleability, confirmation bias, or cognitive dissonance, skew outcomes in the criminal justice system. Blind Injustice has been widely acclaimed in the national media by such outlets as The Economist, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, Salon, and many others. It's also captured the imagination of the arts community. The Cincinnati Opera will perform Blind Injustice, the opera, in June of 2019. And filming is underway for a television docuseries based on the book. And so now, please join me in welcoming Professor Godsey to the podium.
Thank you, Verna, and thank you to the Schott Foundation for supporting this work and for the committee for selecting Blind Injustice and the book for this award this year. I'm very honored. So on the screen, you see this quote by Learned Hand from 1923. Our procedure has been always haunted by the ghost of the innocent man convicted. It is an unreal dream. And here are 9 of those unreal dreams from our Innocence Project here at University of Cincinnati College of Law. 9 of now 27 innocent people the students here at UC have freed just from Ohio, who together served over 500 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Now this quote has been held on to, that's from 1923, but was still widely believed when I was a prosecutor in the 1990s. We're starting to erode that a little bit, but the system is very slow to change. And there are many that still believe this. The 27 here in Ohio are just a small percentage of the over 2,200 innocent people that the Innocence Movement has now identified in the past 25 years, who together have served more than 20,000 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. And we know this 2,200 innocent people is just the tip of the iceberg. Because in every single one of these cases, both nationally, our cases here in Ohio, you look at it and you say, if not for coincidence after coincidence, miracle after miracle, this person never would have been freed. If not for the extra effort that was made at the last minute to try to find the DNA testing, we almost wrote it off. We finally found the DNA. If not for this witness finally showing up in a witness search and being able to identify this person that we tracked down, have been trying to track down for years, if that hadn't happened, that piece of luck, this person never would have been freed. And when you do this work, you see case after case where you begin to believe the person's innocent, but they don't have that little piece of luck. They don't have that one little break in their case. So people think of the innocence movement, I think nationally, it's getting attention now, but they think of it in terms of those Kodak moments when somebody walks out of prison, and they're coming at a rate of about 3 a week now, and on the national news, an innocent person walking out of prison after 20, 30, 40 years. And that's great. That's amazing, right? These innocent people are being freed. But I think what many people don't realize or don't understand, that one of the lasting legacies of the innocence movement is what it has brought to light in terms of how the human mind works. Human failings that cause these wrongful convictions. Because anytime you have a system that thinks it gets it right 100% of the time, like Justice Learned Hand did, and then you have this like shocking moment where all of a sudden innocent people are walking off death row every week, it causes social scientists to start scratching their heads and ask, what the hell is going on here? And they start studying these cases. And so the innocence movement has spawned new understandings in psychology and in how the human mind works, which is what the focus of my book was. I became very fascinated by the psychology behind this movement very early on. So you can't take a book that you worked on for years and condense it down to 20, 30 minutes, right? So it's a big struggle to try to discuss this subject matter in this context. So what I've done is try to pick out just a few of the things that are easy to explain in a lecture like this. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what we've discovered about how confirmation bias affects the system. Wow, that didn't turn out very well. Confirmation bias is the tendency people have to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms their preconceptions. A confirmation bias happens when people give more weight to evidence that confirms their hypothesis and undervalue evidence that could disprove it. So confirmation bias exists in all parts of society. You can see it in politics. Studies show that when there's a presidential debate and Democrats are asked after the debate which candidate appeared more presidential, which one answered the questions more directly, which one was more honest, Democrats will overwhelmingly cite the Democratic candidate. Republicans are asked the exact same question, and they will overwhelmingly say the Republican candidate answered the questions more honestly, was less evasive, appeared more presidential. And it's because we all go into these situations with pre-existing biases, and our mind interprets the evidence we see. We remember the things that confirm our hypothesis, and that's just simply how we're wired. Detectives do the same thing. We now realize, you look at any of these cases of wrongful conviction, tunnel vision, confirmation bias becomes rampant from the beginning. And in a variety of ways. A detective gets a hypothesis, starts getting excited about this tip that they've got. They become convinced, I finally got a suspect. They start interviewing witnesses. Confirmation bias kicks in. They start believing the witnesses. That person was clearly telling the truth, I could tell. The witnesses who confirm their suspicions. Evidence that comes forward that contradicts their suspicion, there's reasons to write it off, to discount it, ignore it. That is a human failing. There's things we can do to correct it, to minimize it, but our system has not yet recognized it. So confirmation bias shows itself in a variety of ways in the criminal justice system. But I'm going to focus on one example, forensic scientists. Because if I can convince you that forensic scientists are contaminated, their work is contaminated by confirmation bias, it's very easy to see how everybody else in the criminal justice system could be as well. Because we hold up forensic scientists, these white lab coat wearing, CSI people from TV who have these fancy degrees from Harvard and all this kind of stuff. That's cold, hard, neutral science, right? All right, we're going to talk about that, but first I'm going to have you do this study. If you've already done this little experiment I'm about to show, please don't raise your hand afterwards. I'm going to show up a sentence on the screen, and I'm going to ask you to take about 10 seconds to count how many F's you see in this sentence. Okay, how many saw 1? Raise your hand. How many saw 2? 2 over here. How many saw 3? Almost everybody. How many saw 4? 5. 6. Okay, the very few people that raised their hand and saw 6 are the ones that got the right answer. Finished files, that's 1, 2. The next line, of. Another of is 4. Fic is 5, and then the of in the last line is F number 6. Okay? You all are expert readers. So your mind has figured out a way to get to the answer it needs very quickly without having to do extra work. So it's trained itself to understand this with literally not seeing those letter Fs in the word of. All right, how is this relevant to forensic sciences? Well, there's a psychologist named Untitled Chapter out of London who studies confirmation bias, and he has a friend who's a fingerprint expert, and over a beer one night, this fingerprint expert was telling him how this is a rock-solid science, they don't really make mistakes, there's clear standards, et cetera. And being an expert in confirmation bias, Untitled Chapter thinks this is bullshit. So he says, I'm going to do an experiment. So this is what he does. He takes leading fingerprint experts, and he sends them 2 fingerprints to examine. And he says, this is from a case where years ago a fingerprint expert said, this fingerprint from the bloody knife matches the defendant. He called it a match and testified in court that it was a match, caused the defendant to get convicted. But we found out later through DNA testing that this guy was completely innocent and was never at the crime scene. So will you evaluate this fingerprint match and tell us where the fingerprint expert went wrong so many years ago? What these fingerprint experts didn't know is that Untitled Chapter had gone into their own files, because these fingerprints are exhibits that get entered into a court file, they're public information. He had pulled a match of fingerprints that expert had testified was a match years earlier in court. Now, fingerprint experts look at fingerprints all day long, so they don't even remember a set they looked at the week before, right? So they're looking at their own work that they called a match. He got 80% of them to flip their answers and say, this is no longer a match. The fingerprint expert clearly missed this, and this. Okay? This has now been replicated over and over again in different forensic sciences. How does this come about? It's because our system does not recognize the effects of confirmation bias. When you're told in advance to expect an answer, you literally see things differently. And the way our system works is, and this is what I did as a prosecutor, we send the fingerprints over and we go, this dude confessed. We got him dead to right. Right? We need you to confirm that this is a match. And when you give pre-existing context to a forensic scientist like that, it actually taints the outcome. They see things differently. Just like you're an expert reader and you've learned not to see the Fs, they will not see things that they otherwise would see if they hadn't been biased beforehand. So it's a failing of the human mind. It's very easy to fix. Right? The National Academy of Sciences came out with procedures where you should give information to forensic scientists in a way that doesn't bias them beforehand, but we're still not doing it. We're still not doing it. The next thing I want to talk about is human memory. Our system does not yet recognize how malleable human memory is. Most people think of their memory as like a tape recorder or like a flash drive that's recording down everything. And we know that we may forget things sometimes. So sometimes little pieces of the hard drive gets erased. But we think that what we remember accurately. We now know, through advances in psychology over the past 20 or 30 years, human memory is extremely malleable. It's not like a tape recorder or a hard drive. It's more like Wikipedia, where not only are we editing our memories when we sleep, everything else, but other people edit our memories as well through suggestion. So I think people don't understand also just how selective our memories are. Like if you go this coming weekend to a kid's birthday party, and you're watching all the things that are going on, the birthday cake and who's there and the balloons, et cetera, I think most people think that they are actually recording everything they're seeing. But our minds can't do that. Our minds can't do that. We've evolved to the point where our minds do us a favor and don't make us record and save everything we see. We're selectively recording things, but like, for example, the color of the birthday cake or what it looked like, or the color of the balloons are really, most of the time, taken from a shared memory. We have like these stock photos of what a kid's birthday cake is supposed to look like. And we may have several of them in our head, and they may be sort of changing all the time. But later, when you try to retrieve what that kid's birthday cake looked like, you will think that is a real memory, and you actually saw it. But unless our brain chose to record that because it was important at that moment, it is likely something that we simply created. If while you were at the birthday party, you weren't really paying attention to who else was there, you may later be asked, was Dave so-and-so at that party? And you might have a very clear memory that that person was not there. And it turns out that he's charged with committing a murder during that party. So if you can verify that he was there, you provide him with an alibi. You may be quite certain that he was not there, but unless that's something you were coding properly, you may have just filled in the gaps with your assumptions and your pre-existing beliefs. So there's all sorts of studies that have come out in recent years showing the malleability of human memory. I can't go into all of them. I do in the book. But, a couple of just quick examples. You show people in a study a videotape of a crime, and the getaway car is blue, and then they're interviewed after watching the tape, and they're told to say what they saw on the tape and describe it, and they say, I saw the getaway car and it was blue, et cetera, et cetera. Later, they come in and they're interviewed about it again, and they're shown reports that were taken down from their prior statements, and the psychologists change one fact. They'll make the getaway car white. And they'll say, we're going to ask you some questions. We want to refresh your memory about what you said last time you were in. And they have everybody read this report, and you'll get about 40% of the people changing their answer and saying the getaway car was white, simply from reading what was written down by another person. And then if you grill them and quiz them about their memory change, they think that they said it was white all along. Now, that is an extremely passive form of suggestion, where you're just having them read a report. In the criminal justice system, and I know this as a prosecutor because I participated in tons of interrogations and proffer sessions, when you have a theory and you have a witness there that's not going along with you, you are grilling that person, right? And suggesting that they're wrong, and many times you will move them along to give a different statement. We call that synthesized testimony. It's another thing that our investigation techniques are not understanding. I didn't understand when I did that, the malleability of human memory. One of the things that many of our clients, like Clarence Elkins, some of the guys we've exonerated, one of the fascinating things to me is when I first met them in prison, they were still confused about how the trial went the way it went. And I remember Clarence Elkins saying, they got all these witnesses to come in and say, I hated my mother-in-law, because that's the person he was charged with murdering. And they would talk about this party, the family party that happened a couple weeks before. I was glaring at her, and I stomped off angry. And it was just so weird because that didn't happen. It didn't happen. And numerous clients will tell that to us. As a prosecutor, I know how that happened. Because if I wanted somebody to come and testify that there was a motive and this guy was angry, I would start asking them very pointed questions pre-trial. And if you've got a witness there that believes that's the killer, and like everybody else wants to put that person away, you can start to move their testimony. The more I think about it, he did seem sort of pissed off. And there was a couple tense exchanges. By the time that person testifies at trial, they're confident that that's what occurred. But many times that testimony has been synthesized through the interview process. So malleable memory manifests itself in many different ways. One is incorrect eyewitness identification, mistaken identification, which is present in 75% of the wrongful convictions. I'm going to show you a lineup from a case, Jerome White. So this was a rape case, and the victim described the perpetrator as stocky and well-built. And there is only one of those five that meets that description. It's the guy on the right. Okay? This was a live lineup. She was there in the room. She picked the guy in the middle, who ended up serving 20 years in prison before DNA testing proved that not only he was innocent, but the guy on the far right was the actual perpetrator. Now, how did that come about? What I'm about to describe is a very consistent pattern. Before this occurred, the day before this occurred, they brought her down to the police station and showed her a bunch of pictures. And out of the five guys there, the only picture she had seen the day before was the guy in the middle. And so now they bring her back the next day, and she immediately recognizes the person in the middle and ends up identifying him as the perpetrator, not realizing she's misattributing where that flash of recognition came from. And studies show that once that happens, I mean, if you watch Making a Murderer, Penny Bernstein, who wrongfully identified Stephen Avery, Jennifer Thompson, the famous book Picking Cotton, once that happens, if they replay the crime in their head, they continue to see the innocent person, even after they know through DNA testing and other things like that the person's innocent. I mean, as Jennifer Thompson, who was a rape victim who identified the incorrect perpetrator, said, you know, it's like stew. It's like you've been put in a blender. And after you've had your memory messed up, you can't ever tell. You can't ever reconstruct it accurately. False confessions is another way that memory malleability manifests itself in wrongful convictions. I mean, everybody sits there and thinks, if I didn't commit a murder, there's no way I would confess to something I didn't do, ever. In recent years, we even had an Ohio Supreme Court justice say that in response to a statement by one of our attorneys arguing in the Ohio Supreme Court. Come on, nobody would say that if they didn't do it. There's many different causes of wrongful conviction, but one of them is caused by memory malleability, where a person is under interrogation for hours and hours and hours. And as it said in the little clip from the documentary, police are able to lie. So they'll stage these things during the interrogation where the phone rings in the interrogation room, answers that, oh, that's really interesting. We just got a DNA match to your DNA at the crime scene. And it becomes gaslighting. And after hours and hours, the person begins to question their own sense of reality and becomes convinced that they must have done this. And they don't think the police can actually lie. And what we've realized through the process is that the process of interrogation where the pointed questions are suggesting to the person what happened, because the police know. And so by the time they get so confused and disoriented that they start to adopt what the police have said, they know how the crime occurred. And so they'll have a false confession that appears reliable, not because they know what happened, because the questions told them what happened, the questions coming from the police officer. Later in court, they stand up and say, nobody would have known all these details but the true perpetrator. Okay? There's some experiments. I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but you know, Elizabeth Loftus is a famous psychologist who did experiments on college students. And one of the things she was doing is she would interview their family, and she would find like 3 incidents that happened that were, you know, sort of formative when they were young or adolescents. And then she would add a 4th one, which is when you were about 7 years old, you got lost in a mall. Okay? And she would have the students read these things that their family had put together about their childhood. 3 of them would be real, and 1 of them would be the made-up lost in a mall. And simply from reading that, about 25% of the students remembered being lost in a mall. And then were able to add details to it, that they were now what they didn't know, but they were bringing in from other memories and things like that. And after that happens, they're then asked, one of the 4 memories is false that we just told you. One of those 4 didn't happen, and they're unable to identify which one didn't happen. These are all studies that are done that are not very close to how interrogations occur, where very intense pressure. But a recent one out of Canada, they did on college students where they basically interrogated them under the Reed technique, very similar to how police officers do it in the United States, and they got 75% of college students to confess to having committed an armed robbery prior to coming to college. Okay? They got information from the family about who they likely hung out with during the adolescent years and the name of a local store, so it seemed very real. And after grilling and intense interrogation, they got 75% of the college students to confess to this. Now, when you go and you tell people, but guess what, you were in an experiment, this didn't really happen, a lot of times they get really confused. They call their family and say, they're telling me I didn't really rob the store. The third thing I want to talk about is lie detection and demeanor evidence. This is Amanda Knox, who, by the way, is going to be here Thursday. I'm going to plug the next event at 4:30. She was the American student who was wrongfully convicted of Italy, of murdering her roommate. She's going to be here this Thursday at 4:30 in this room. This is her interview with Diane Sawyer. I was writing this book when this happened. And after this interview took place, you had all these pundits on Talk TV saying, like, look at the way like her lip twitched when she answered this question. She was lying. And then you go online and you see these articles about it, and then everybody in the public is filling in the comment boxes like, yeah, she's totally lying. Look at the way she like looked away. Our criminal justice system is built on the belief that human beings are good lie detectors. In fact, jurors are told today that that's why you're here, and look at the demeanor of the witnesses testifying and use your instincts to determine who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth. Recent breakthroughs in psychology now tell us that that is completely false. That is folklore. And human beings are about 54% barely better than a coin flip at determining who's telling the truth and who's not. This has been done in study after study involving now over 20,000 different subjects. And it always comes down to about 54% accurate. I don't want to run out of time. There's a bunch of studies I could explain. They're in the book. And so what I'm going to do is this. Instead of continuing talking about demeanor, I'm going to change the subject for a second and then come back. As I said at the beginning, my sabbatical project was to try to disseminate these ideas to the public because psychologists understand this. Certain aspects of our society understand these issues, but the criminal justice system doesn't. It has not absorbed them. I mean, just by way of one example, the National Security Administration started after 9/11 training the NSA investigators at the airport to use the read technique to look for, this is what police officers are trained on, to look for the eye twitches and the lack of gaze and the fidgety to determine who's lying as they're being screening people at the airport. And when Congress got wind of this, over $1 billion had been spent, there was this huge inquiry where they came out with a report saying, this is complete junk science. You guys wasted $1.2 billion training all these TSA agents on what is widely recognized in the psychological fields as junk science. So we recognize that in Congress, yet we're continuing to train police officers to determine whether people are telling the truth with these same techniques, and we continue to encourage jurors not to look at the big picture, but to look at people's micro-expressions to determine if they're lying or telling the truth. That's just one example. So my sabbatical project was to try to spread this out to the public. One of the things I've been doing is working on the docuseries. One of the things is the opera, which Verna mentioned is going to be actually next July. Hopefully it'll travel around to different cities after that. And it actually, it's more of a musical. I wouldn't say opera, it's more of a musical, but it actually has songs about confirmation bias and forensic mad scientists cooking up junk science in a lab. And so hopefully that'll also educate. I've been doing some writing as well, NPR interviews and things like that. But one of the things that I worked on with Pierce Reed, who's our new attorney who's in charge of education. Pierce, are you here? Is that this was the suggestion of actually Kathy Brinkman, who's on our board, is we created a bunch of videos that can be used to train police officers, prosecutors, hopefully criminal justice professors will start using these in the classrooms that are like short and punchy and get to the point and convey these items, these issues, so that we can start educating the criminal justice system slowly. So instead of continuing to talk about demeanor and human lie detection, I'm going to play one of those videos of a leading expert on this topic. We created, Pierce and I were in New York in June and shot these for a week. They're going to be released on October 2nd, which is International Wrongful Conviction Day. And they are on 7 different topics. So this is the one on lie detection and demeanor.
We try to observe what's going on the outside to get to what is going on the inside. People often overestimate their skill at reading other people's mind. It's quite difficult actually to get to another person's inner states. The leakage hypothesis has been around for a long time, and the idea is that liars will leak different cues, so to speak, than truth tellers. The idea with micro-expressions falls under the leakage hypothesis. Micro-expressions are expressions that are shown for fractions of a second in the facial muscles. That has scientific support. But the problem with this is that liars and truth tellers, they both show micro-expressions. And there's no micro-expressions that only liars show and no truth teller. So this is a problem with the idea of using micro-expressions to detect deceit. When you use these nonverbal cues, you perform just a bit better than chance level, 54%, and chance level is 50%. We also know from research that This also holds for police officers. They don't perform better. The only difference between police officers and others that have been studied is that police officers are more confident that they are accurate. So this is a dangerous combination, having poor accuracy but high confidence. One source of being highly confident is that you think that you have used reliable cues. You think that, well, I have used the cues I've been taught, and therefore I'm absolutely certain that this person is lying or telling the truth. People tend to use nonverbal cues, gaze or fidgeting and so on. But what research shows is that there are no associations between fidgeting, eye contact, nervousness, and deception. Within the scientific community, there's no debate about this. The read technique is very problematic, and especially when it comes to the guidance that the technique gives for detecting deceit. One argument that comes up is that others might go wrong, but I know which specific nonverbal cues that work. But the problem with that argument is that there are no reliable nonverbal cues. The second argument is that, well, I don't look at one nonverbal cue, I look at many at the same time. But the problem is that if there are no reliable nonverbal cues, it doesn't matter if you use one or if you use many. So today we can see a shift of paradigm that goes from the nonverbal approach and the emotional approach, which is about trying to read a person's inner mental states by observing behavior, to the cognitive approach. What you should do is to go for speech content. You can look for inconsistencies. It can be an inconsistency between what you know and the person is telling you. Use the background information that you have as an interrogator in an optimal way. You can look whether the person is telling things that can be verified or not, because the person can talk a lot, but he or she doesn't say anything that can be verified. You should also ask unanticipated questions or ask the suspect to respond in a format that is not anticipated. For example, to draw a sketch instead of verbally answering a question. That's the way forward for lie detection.
There are 7 of these: eyewitness ID, false confessions, demeanor and lie detection, tunnel vision, malleable memory, confirmation bias, and I'm going to play one more that's very short. But I just think everybody needs to hear this, see this. This is on implicit bias.
So to understand unconscious racial bias, we need to understand a little bit about how our brains work. Our brains learn through associations. They make quick, unconscious, and automatic associations in response to a stimulus. And the reasons our brains do this is because they're efficient information processors. I'm sure when you walk into a room and you sit down at a chair, you don't spend even a second thinking about that strange object that you're sitting upon, because your brains have learned what a chair looks like and what you do with a chair. Your brains do that about everything, including people. And what our brains have learned is that certain people are associated with certain things. So for instance, if I were walking down the street and I saw a young black man that I didn't recognize, my unconscious brain would automatically, quickly, and unconsciously bring up all of the associations that it's learned about young black men. Most individuals, regardless of our race, associate young black men with criminality and dangerousness. And even if that unconscious association would conflict with my own conscious, egalitarian beliefs, it would still influence my behaviors, my judgments, my perceptions in ways that I would be completely unaware of and therefore unable to control. Although I myself am a woman, and I'm Korean, and I'm black, I had all of the unconscious biases that most people of all races have. So many of you may have heard of the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test. When I took the Implicit Association Test, what it demonstrated is that I associated white men with positive things and black men with negative things. I associated women with the home and men with the workplace. And I do not consciously subscribe to these biases, so I don't have an explicit bias, but I had an implicit bias. And that's the difference between the two. So being a conscious racist and having unconscious racial biases are not equivalent things. So unconscious biases tend to influence us in situations that are ambiguous. And so when a situation is ambiguous, your brain will fill in the missing pieces, and often it will do this with the unconscious associations that it's learned. And as a result of that, you might treat two people engaged in identical behaviors differently. So these unconscious biases can influence every actor within the criminal justice system, regardless of whether you're a judge, a prosecutor, a public defender, or a juror. Every actor within the criminal justice system will be influenced by these unconscious biases. So what can we do? If I could leave you with just one piece of advice, and this is going to be the hardest piece of advice, believe me, I know that, it would be to slow down. Because I know that all of us who act within the criminal justice system want a system that's fair and want a system that's just. And I know many of you are now thinking, I can't slow down, we have too many cases, we have to get through the calendar. I get it, I was in the criminal justice system myself. So slowing down, being aware of the circumstances when you might act on your unconscious biases, obtaining more information are all things that you can do to try to reduce the impact of these unconscious biases on your behaviors and judgments.
Okay, so I think I don't know if I can take questions or not. I think I've taken up all the time. I don't know, who's in charge? I guess I'll take questions if somebody wants to walk out. If you need to go somewhere, you can. But who wants to stay, I can answer questions. Yeah, Chris.
Touched on a little mark in this video and in the prior one, but more globally, as to some of these things, what, if anything, can be done? Sometimes it can feel kind of discouraging in the sense it kind of feels like that humans just aren't built to get the right answers.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because chapter 8 of my book goes into that. So no, I'm just kidding. These are human failings, so they cannot be completely controlled. Some of them can, like the confirmation bias in forensic sciences. You can set up screening procedures that make so that the person has no idea which direction they're supposed to go with this before they start looking at the evidence. There are interview techniques that can decrease the chance that you're going to contaminate the memory. I mean, we're going to eventually get to the point where we treat human memory in an investigation like a crime scene. Like right now when a crime occurs, we come and we tape it off with yellow tape to make sure nobody goes in there and puts their hair and DNA and saliva and everything else. We got to get to the point where we treat human memory as carefully. There are techniques for doing that, but we're not learning them. Would those techniques completely erase the chance that there's an altered memory that results in a wrongful conviction? No. But they minimize, so it's a matter of minimizing. So with all of these things, it's awareness and training is done to mitigate to the extent possible. And if we were doing that, I would say, great, because we're doing the best we can. We're human. We're never going to have an error-free system. But we're not doing that. We're not doing that. In fact, there's been a lot of resistance to trying to make change, which is always the case. Anytime you have, when Copernicus, came out and said that the Earth is not the center of the universe, it's the sun, we understood the idea of gravity and, and orbits. And we were able to start seeing new planets, and the people who agreed with the establishment and thought Copernicus was radical would come up with these crazy theories why we're seeing these planets go in these weird things that don't make sense with orbiting around the Earth. They make sense with orbiting around the sun. But all the scholarship justified the pre-existing notions, and that's sort of what we're in right now. I believe we're at the beginning of a transformation of the criminal justice system that's going to take a long time. Yeah.
the Innocence Project takes on?
The question was, what determines what cases the Innocence Project takes on? That's a really complicated question, but the law in Ohio requires new evidence. So just looking at a case and saying this person shouldn't have been convicted isn't enough. There has to be something that's happened more recently, like a DNA test or a discovery that the forensics that were used in the case were improper, or some sort of credible new witness coming forward. So it's pretty much dictated by the law of the jurisdiction. Yeah, there's a question in the back. Because of memory? How often are wrongful convictions? What is the percentage of wrongful convictions? I can tell you that the percentage of wrongful convictions that have been discovered of the overall number of criminal convictions is very small. So I've heard commentators say, well, look at the 2,200, that's 0.001% of the convictions of felonies that have occurred in this country over the past 25 years, so therefore this is not a serious problem. I can tell you that that's inaccurate because anybody who does this can say, wow, there's got to be way, way, way more than this because every one of these cases requires so much luck. There are scholarly studies out there that have estimated that the percentage of innocent people in prison is like between 2 and 5%. You don't know, you can't know what you don't know, right? And so it's impossible to really know. All I can tell you is that what we've discovered, I believe, is very much the tip of the iceberg. The very, very tip of the iceberg. Does anybody from the Innocence Project, Donald, Jennifer, Brian, do you guys have an opinion about that? Give a more concrete answer.
I mean, National Academy of Sciences did a study 5-6 years ago that estimated the error rate on death row at 4%, which means 1 in every 25 people on death row shouldn't be there.
Mark, what happened to the National Academy of Sciences report?
So for forensics, in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences, which is an independent think tank created by Congress, by President Lincoln actually, which advises Congress on scientific issues, decided 5 years earlier to do a massive study of the problem with forensics in this country. Came out in 2009 with a 500-page report that is just scathing, talking about confirmation bias and these sciences we use, gunshot residue and bite mark and the arson. This is stuff that were made up on the spot by police officers, not using the scientific method, not peer-reviewed, let me just give you one. There's so much to talk about. We'll give you one example. Our 3 clients at East Cleveland 3 were convicted. One of the main pieces of evidence was that they had a little bit of gunshot residue on them. It was a day when a shooting occurred. I think one of them had a little bit on the jacket and one on the hand. So that's extremely powerful evidence, right? Prosecutors say in closing arguments, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how many of you have gunshot residue on you right now? Oh, what a coinky-dink. 2 of the 3 guys here we have charged have gunshot residue on the day that the shooting occurred. But what somebody eventually realized is that gunshot residue is all over police cars and police departments. If you take 10 people and you make sure they're absolutely clean and you handcuff them behind their back and stick them in a police car, take them down to the police station, handcuff them to an interrogation desk, a very high percentage of them will have gunshot residue on them because police officers have to do all this training and firing. In addition, there's just steps being made and steps being missed all the time because these forensics have not been developed in a laboratory setting, in a university setting where the scientific method is being employed. So in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences came out with this report saying we need to completely overhaul how things are done. And so, what's amazing to me is I'll give speeches now and I'll be talking to judges and they'll have no idea. They never heard of the National Academy of Sciences report. We worked for a long time to try to get one of the recommendations, which is the National Forensics Commission set up, to start controlling this and issuing standards, to start reforming this. Finally got it done, and then when Trump and Jeff Sessions came into office, they defunded it. So it's back down to ground zero, and then it's going to be a battle to try to get up to that point where we can have a review of forensics that will hopefully start overhauling all of this. That's one of the easier things that we can try to fix out of all of these problems. There are very clear, identifiable things we can do. Yeah.
I was glad to see that clip on implicit bias at the end, because when you were talking about confirmation bias, that's immediately where I went. I was like, are there studies that talk about how confirmation bias can be affected by people's own implicit bias that they carry around?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's a starting point. Like in the criminal justice system, we will create a confirmation bias in an expert, which actually taints what they see when they're doing the evaluation. But any kind of pre-existing bias is affecting how you filter the information, what you see, what you don't see, and what you retain. And so in the book, in the introduction, I say I'm not going to talk about racial bias in the book. And I did that specifically because when you do that, I think people immediately go, well, okay, this first of all, it would swallow the book. It would swallow the book. It would become mostly about, because that is the biggest problem, which I identify right up front. But as soon as you do that, people become defensive and they say, this doesn't apply to me. But the things I talk about, like confirmation bias, are the building blocks. So if you can sort of disarm them and get them to read all these different things, and then you can come back in the end and you can say, see, it's really about racism. So I did that intentionally. But then I wanted to have a video about implicit bias when we did this to roll out to police officers and things like that. Yeah. It's gradually evolved, and these videos right now, we are trying to get the endorsement of the National Police Chief Association, and it's made it through several steps where they have viewed them, and it's passed through committee. I mean, Pierce, you probably know more than I do, but we're hopeful that the National Association of Police, Chief of Police, is going to endorse these videos, which would be huge. Ron O'Brien, who's the prosecutor in Columbus, read my book and invited Pierce and I to come up on December 6th and do a lecture to his entire office of prosecutors. And I wish I could have recorded the call, because he read the book, he called me up, and he said, you know, it was eye-opening, and I've talked about some of these things, but I haven't been able to articulate it before until I read this book, and now I can articulate them better. But I've talked about these things to my line prosecutors, but some of them are knuckleheads. And, you know, and I want you to come in, and I want to have this conversation. I want us to start talking about this. Would that happen in a lot of other prosecutors' offices? Not yet. But I think most of them want to do the right thing. They want to do it right. They go into it to do the right thing for the right reasons. And it's like, and there's a whole chapter in my book about this, about how slow bureaucracies are to move and how slow people in bureaucracies are to accept change. They're conditioned that way. So it's to me, it's more about education, and it's less about people saying, I just don't want to do it right. So this is about education. They all want to do it right. Yeah.
Are there particular cities or states or governments elsewhere who, you know, might be addressing these issues that you look to as a model, you know, addressing these issues effectively, or is it something that you see everyone is just struggling with equally, and nobody really has a good answer to it right now, you know, on policy?
Canada is doing some of this. Scotland has made some of the forensic changes. There's other issues that I didn't go into in this lecture that are in the book about the cognitive dissonance and like, so the team association that comes from being a prosecutor or being a defense attorney, and how that contributes to these other factors through time. And there are many European countries that require you to be like a prosecutor for a year, then a defense attorney for a year, and back and forth, which I think would be an incredible experience. I don't think they did that for these reasons, because they've been doing that for decades before these psychological issues were known or understood. But, you know, there's innocence movement spreading across the world, and in November I'll be in Barcelona for the European Innocence Conference. And, you know, the people in Sweden, for example, have had a rich literature of the effects of confirmation bias in the criminal justice system that's been going on for decades. And there's professors who have gotten tenure and made their, you know, career on this sort of stuff, but it just hasn't translated over. We're sort of behind them, that this is just now starting to become known in the United States. So it's all over the place. Yeah.
In my practice, I've noticed that a lot of police officers and detectives, once they think they know who the suspect is, they go for that person and they discount other evidence. They don't even think that it's possibly exculpatory, and they won't turn it over to the prosecutor's office.
When you look at some of these cases, like in the Innocence Project, our cases here, you'll see these things where some of the evidence of innocence came forward pretty early on, and it just got completely ignored and discounted. And looking back on it, it's easy to just say, well, those guys were corrupt, those detectives were corrupt, they were just trying to convict an innocent person. That's rarely the case. Because we're all human, because they're human, they suffer from confirmation bias and tunnel vision, and they literally cannot objectively evaluate the evidence anymore. So when something, once they're so sold on this theory that they finally got the guy who did it, particularly if they've gone on TV and they've had press conferences and all this kind of stuff, it's very hard for the human mind to ever look at contradictory evidence objectively. So like in the Clarence Elkins case, it was one of our cases, he was convicted of murder, and it was based on the testimony of a 6-year-old girl who saw the attacker, in the dark, under great trauma. She was only conscious for a few seconds before she got knocked unconscious. And they went out and arrested Clarence and were on TV that they had the perpetrator within a couple hours. And then everything else that came forward in the investigation after that contradicted that theory. And there was no forensics at the scene connecting Clarence to the crime, and it was a bloodbath and hair and evidence everywhere. Nothing matched Clarence. And they arrested him a couple hours later, but there was no blood in his car or his clothing or nothing. They scoured his drains, thinking that he had showered off all the blood. They could find nothing in his drains. So later, after he was exonerated through DNA testing, we were able to actually find the true perpetrator through DNA testing, who's now serving life in prison. There was a civil suit. Once we identified the true perpetrator, his name's Earl Mann, they went and looked at his rap sheet, and they deposed the officers who had arrested Earl Mann after he had committed the crime that Clarence Elkins was in prison for. And it turns out that while Clarence Elkins was awaiting trial, Earl Mann, the true perpetrator, was arrested, and he said when he was arrested for something else, he was arrested for something else, and he said, "I thought you were arresting me for the murder of Judy Johnson." And that was the case that Clarence Elkins was awaiting trial on. The officer who was arresting Earl Mann is not on the Clarence Elkins case. He doesn't have confirmation bias and tunnel vision. He does what he's supposed to do. He writes up a report and sends it off to the detectives who are in charge of Clarence Elkins' case, who get it and who totally discount it. Totally discount it. Wasn't even turned over to the defense, which is a Brady violation. Years later, the DNA comes back and shows that Earl Mann was the actual perpetrator. If they had not suffered from tunnel vision, if they had tried to stay open-minded and done an investigation into Earl Mann, it would have become very apparent very quickly that he was a better suspect than Clarence Elkins. And you see that sort of thing over and over and over again. Training can help with that. Training can help with that.
All right, well, let's thank Mark for this wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.